People chase joy like it's a prize waiting at the end of the race. They build careers, fall in love, travel the world, and buy everything they can touch. But when the noise fades, something still feels missing. That emptiness is not a defect, it's a message, a call to confront the truths most people run from. Stoics didn't escape pain, they studied it. They didn't chase joy. They learned how to build it from within. And until these lessons are understood, not memorized, but joy will always be temporary, like water slipping through clenched fists. This is not about becoming emotionless, it's about becoming unbreakable. What you're about to hear isn't just philosophy, it's the quiet blueprint of a life that you wake up in a life that looks like success. The apartment is clean, the bank account stable, the relationships functioning. You've checked the boxes society handed you, completed the assignments that promised fulfillment. Yet, something sits beneath your chest, like a stone that won't dissolve. A restlessness that follows you from morning coffee to midnight scrolling. This isn't depression, though it might wear that mask. This isn't anxiety, though it might borrow those clothes. This is something more fundamental, more human. It's the quiet ache that emerges when external achievements fail to fill the space they promised to occupy. You thought success would taste different. You thought love would feel more complete. You thought having more would mean needing less. But here you are, surrounded by everything you worked for, and the hunger remains. Modern psychology calls this the hedonic treadmill, the endless cycle where each pleasure, each achievement, each new acquisition provides a brief spike of satisfaction before settling back to baseline. You buy the car, feel joy for weeks, then it becomes Tuesday's transportation. You get the promotion, celebrate for a weekend, then it becomes Wednesday's expectation. The treadmill keeps moving and you keep running, but you never actually arrive anywhere new. The ancient Greeks had a word for this, pleonexia, the insatiable desire to have more. They recognized it not as a personality flaw, but as a fundamental characteristic of the human condition. We are creatures designed to want, to reach, to grasp. Our ancestors needed this drive to survive, more food, better shelter, safer territory. But in a world where survival is largely secured, this same mechanism turns against us, creating a chronic dissatisfaction that no external condition can permanently resolve. You feel this most acutely in the quiet moments, when the Netflix episode ends and silence fills the room, when you're driving alone and the music can't quite cover the space between your thoughts, when you're lying next to someone you love, feeling grateful and empty simultaneously. These are the moments when the ache surfaces, polite but persistent, like a guest who won't leave but won't explain why they came. The Stoics understood this ache differently than we do. Where we see it as a problem to solve, they saw it as information to decode. Where we try to medicate it with more experiences, more achievements, more connections, they learned to sit with it and listen. They discovered that this restlessness isn't a bug in the human system. It's a feature pointing towards something we've forgotten how to access. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal while governing an empire and leading armies, captured this perfectly. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He wasn't writing from a monastery or a mountaintop. He was writing from the battlefield of human existence, covered in the dust of real problems, real responsibilities, real loss. Yet he had discovered something that made him less dependent on circumstances for his sense of completeness. This discovery begins with a radical shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I get what I want?" the question becomes, "How can I want what I have?" Instead of, "When will I finally be happy?" It becomes, what is preventing me from accessing the contentment that already exists? The ache you feel isn't evidence that your life is missing something essential. It's evidence that you're human, equipped with a consciousness capable of transcending immediate circumstances. The very fact that you can feel dissatisfied with external success means you're designed for something more substantial than external success can provide. But understanding this intellectually and living it experientially are different territories entirely. The Stoics didn't just think their way to peace, they practiced their way there. They developed exercises, habits, and perspectives that slowly, methodically transformed their relationship with desire, disappointment, and the inevitable difficulties of being alive. They learned that joy isn't something you find like a treasure buried in the right circumstances. Joy is something you build, like a muscle strengthened through conscious repetition. It's not dependent on getting what you want, but on cultivating a particular way of engaging with whatever you receive. This might sound like settling for less, but it's actually the opposite. It's discovering that what you thought you needed was a pale imitation of what's actually available. External things can enhance your experience, but they cannot create your experience. That capacity lives somewhere else entirely. The Stoics called this place your ruling center, the part of you that observes, chooses, and responds. It's the space between what happens to you and how you interpret what happens to you. In that space lies a freedom that no external circumstance can touch, a source of stability that doesn't depend on whether your plans work out, or your relationships remain smooth, or your health stays strong. But accessing this space requires confronting some uncomfortable truths about how you've been approaching fulfillment. It means examining the stories you tell yourself about what you need to be content. It means questioning whether the strategies you've been using to build happiness are actually working or just keeping you busy enough to avoid noticing they're not working. The ache beneath it all isn't your enemy. It's your teacher, pointing toward a different way of being that most people never discover because they're too busy trying to make it stop. The Stoics learned to welcome this teacher, to let it guide them towards something more reliable than the emotional weather of daily life. What they found there changes everything. Picture the moment you got everything you thought you wanted. Maybe it was the job, the relationship, the apartment, the recognition. Remember how it felt in your body, the relief, the triumph, the sense that you had finally arrived at the place where happiness lives. Now remember how long that feeling lasted before it became normal, before your baseline shifted and you began reaching for the next thing. This isn't a personal failing. This is human architecture. Your brain is designed to habituate, to take miraculous things and make them ordinary so you can focus on potential threats and opportunities. The same neurological process that prevents you from being overwhelmed by the sensation of your clothes against your skin also prevents you from maintaining lasting joy about achievements and acquisitions. What felt extraordinary on Tuesday becomes background noise by Thursday. What seemed like the answer to your restlessness becomes part of the restlessness itself. The ancient Stoics observed this pattern without the benefit of modern neuroscience, but their conclusions were remarkably precise. They noticed that external things, wealth, status, possessions, even relationships, could enhance experience but could not create lasting contentment because they existed outside the sphere of your complete control. Epictetus, who spent years as a slave before becoming one of history's most influential philosophers, understood this viscerally. He had experienced both the powerlessness of having nothing and the illusion of security that comes with having something. His conclusion was startling in its simplicity. Wealth consists in not having great possessions, but in having few wants. But this insight goes deeper than minimalism or voluntary simplicity. It's about understanding where satisfaction actually comes from. Consider your relationship with your phone. When you first got it, you marveled at its capabilities. Now you feel irritated when it takes 3 seconds to load. The phone didn't change, your expectations did. This is psychological adaptation in action, and it applies to everything external. The perfect partner who becomes familiar, the dream house that becomes Tuesday's backdrop, the exciting career that becomes Wednesday's routine. You might think this means you're choosing the wrong things, that better external conditions would create lasting satisfaction. But research consistently shows that people who win the lottery return to their baseline happiness levels within months. People who suffer major accidents report similar happiness levels to the general population after adapting to their new circumstances. Your emotional thermostat is more powerful than your external thermostat. The Stoics saw this clearly. If your peace depends on circumstances remaining favorable, you will never have peace, because circumstances are fundamentally unreliable. Markets crash, relationships end, health changes, bodies age, loved ones die. Building your happiness on a foundation that constantly shifts is like building a house on sand during earthquake season. But if external things can't provide lasting satisfaction, why do they feel so important? Why does getting what you want feel so necessary, so urgent, so meaningful in the moment? The answer lies in what psychologists call the focusing illusion. Your tendency to overestimate how much any single factor will impact your overall well-being. When you're hungry, food seems like the key to happiness. When you're lonely, relationship feels like the answer. When you're broke, money appears to be the solution. But each of these addresses only one variable in the complex equation of human contentment. Think about a time when you were completely absorbed in an activity, reading a compelling book, having an engaging conversation, working on a creative project. In those moments, you weren't thinking about what you lacked. You weren't measuring your life against some imagined ideal. You were fully present with what was happening, and in that presence, satisfaction emerged naturally. This points towards something the Stoics understood intuitively. Contentment isn't about having the right external conditions. It's about developing the right internal conditions. It's about cultivating a way of being that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not because the future doesn't matter, but because your capacity to experience fulfillment exists only in the present moment." When you're mentally in the future, imagining how different things will be when you get what you want, you're missing the actual experience of being alive right now. The tragedy isn't that external things fail to satisfy. The tragedy is that while you're waiting for external things to create satisfaction, you're overlooking the capacity for satisfaction that already exists within your current experience. You're like someone standing in a garden, staring at pictures of other gardens, wondering why you feel disconnected from nature. This doesn't mean external things don't matter. The Stoics weren't advocating for poverty or isolation. They enjoyed good food, valued friendship, and appreciated beauty. But they held these things lightly, understanding them as enhancements to experience rather than requirements for contentment. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, practiced voluntary discomfort regularly, sleeping on hard floors, eating simple food, wearing rough clothes, not as punishment, but as training. He wanted to know, experientially, that his well-being didn't depend on luxury. This practice freed him to enjoy wealth without being enslaved by it. The freedom the Stoics discovered isn't the freedom to get what you want. It's the freedom from needing things to be different than they are in order to access peace. It's the recognition that your capacity for joy is not located in your circumstances, but in your relationship with your circumstances. And that relationship is entirely within your control. Somewhere in your mind lives a version of your life where everything has fallen into place. In this imagined existence, your relationships are smooth, your work is fulfilling, your health is strong, and your days unfold with the gentle predictability of a well-written story. You might not consciously believe this perfect life is attainable, but you live as if it might be, making decisions based on the assumption that the right combination of choices, effort, and luck will eventually deliver you to a place where struggle ends and satisfaction begins. This myth is so deeply embedded in human thinking that questioning it feels almost heretical. We're surrounded by stories, in movies, books, social media, conversations, that suggest life's problems are solvable, that difficulties are temporary detours on the path to eventual ease. The narrative promises that if you work hard enough, choose wisely enough, plan carefully enough, you can construct circumstances that will reliably produce happiness. The Stoics saw this myth as one of humanity's most dangerous delusions. They understood that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced, and that reality includes uncertainty, loss, disappointment, and pain as fundamental features, not temporary glitches. Marcus Aurelius, who had more power than perhaps any human in history, wrote repeatedly about the inevitability of frustration and the futility of expecting circumstances to cooperate with your preferences. Accept the things to which fate binds you and love the people with whom fate associates you, he reminded himself, not because he had achieved some Zen-like detachment, but because he had learned through experience that fighting reality only amplifies suffering. But if the perfect life is a myth, why do you feel such urgency about improving your circumstances? Why does it seem so reasonable to believe that the right job, relationship, living situation, or achievement will finally provide the stability you're seeking? The answer lies in what psychologists call the peak end rule, your tendency to judge experiences based on their most intense moment and how they concluded. When good things happen, you feel great in that moment, and the memory of feeling great convinces you that more good things will create more sustained greatness. But you forget about adaptation, about the way extraordinary quickly becomes ordinary, about the fact that your emotional baseline is more powerful than your external conditions. You also forget about the hedonic treadmill, the way each fulfilled desire creates new desires, the way solving one category of problems reveals new categories of problems you hadn't noticed before. The person struggling financially dreams of the problems wealthy people face. The single person envies the complications of relationships. The healthy person can't imagine how people with chronic illness find joy, while people with chronic illness often develop a depth of appreciation that healthy people lack. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And realism, the Stoics discovered, is actually more optimistic than fantasy because it's based on working with reality instead of fighting it. Consider how much energy you spend trying to arrange circumstances to match your preferences. You plan, strategize, worry, effort your way toward conditions that you believe will make you feel the way you want to feel. Sometimes this works temporarily. Often it doesn't work at all, but even when it works, it requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant adjustment as circumstances shift and your preferences evolve. The Stoics asked a radical question. What if peace doesn't require perfect circumstances? What if contentment is available even when things aren't going according to plan? Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what's up to us and what's not up to us. This wasn't just philosophical categorization, it was practical training for investing energy where it could actually make a difference. You can control your choices, your responses, your attention, and your effort. You cannot control outcomes, other people's decisions, natural events, or the passage of time. The myth of the perfect life persuades you to invest enormous energy trying to control things that aren't up to you, leaving little energy for developing the things that are up to you. You spend so much time trying to arrange external conditions that you neglect the internal conditions that actually determine your experience of those external conditions. Imagine two people stuck in traffic. One spends the time frustrated, angry, mentally rehearsing complaints about road planning and other drivers. The other uses the time to listen to music, practice breathing exercises, or simply observe the world outside the window. Same external circumstances, completely different internal experiences. The difference isn't that one person has a better life, it's that one person has developed a better relationship with the life they have. This is what the Stoics meant by living according to nature, not withdrawing from civilization or accepting passivity, but aligning your expectations with reality instead of fighting reality until it matches your expectations. The perfect life myth tells you that problems are temporary inconveniences on the path to eventual ease. Stoicism tells you that problems are permanent features of existence and that peace comes from developing a different relationship with problems, not from eliminating them. The perfect life myth suggests that the right circumstances will create lasting happiness. Stoicism suggests that the right perspective will create happiness regardless of circumstances. The perfect life myth promises that enough effort will eventually deliver you to a place where effort is no longer required. Stoicism promises that the right kind of effort directed toward what's actually within your control, will transform your experience of effort itself. This isn't about lowering your standards or abandoning your goals. It's about building your sense of worth and peace on something more reliable than whether your plans work out exactly as intended. It's about discovering that the life you're living right now, with all its imperfections and uncertainties, already contains everything necessary for deep satisfaction. You just have to learn how to see it. The greatest battles aren't fought on distant fields, but in the quiet spaces of your own mind. Every day, you engage in conflicts that determine the quality of your inner life. The struggle between acceptance and resistance, between gratitude and entitlement, between presence and distraction. These internal wars shape your experience more than any external circumstance, yet they're often invisible, even to yourself. You wake up and immediately begin negotiating with reality. The weather should be different, traffic should move faster, people should behave more reasonably, your body should feel better, your mood should be more stable. This constant, subtle resistance to what is creates a background tension that colors every moment, like a song played slightly off-key. The Stoics recognized this internal resistance as the primary source of human suffering. Not pain itself, but the resistance to pain. Not change itself, but the resistance to change. Not uncertainty itself, but the resistance to uncertainty. They saw that while you cannot always control what happens to you, you can learn to control your response to what happens to you, and that this control is where freedom actually lives. But this war within has many fronts, and understanding them is essential for developing the capacity to choose your responses rather than being controlled by them. The first battlefield is attachment. You form emotional bonds not just with people, but with outcomes, expectations, and ideas about how things should unfold. When reality conflicts with these attachments, you suffer, not because something terrible has happened, but because something different from your preference has happened. The strength of your suffering often correlates not with the objective severity of the situation, but with the strength of your attachment to it being different. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This wasn't philosophical theory for him. As emperor, he faced plagues, wars, betrayals, and the constant pressure of decisions that affected millions of lives. He learned through necessity that his peace couldn't depend on everything going according to plan, because nothing ever went according to plan. The second battlefield is fear, specifically fear of loss. You live in constant, often unconscious anticipation that the good things in your life might disappear. This creates a paradox. The more you have to lose, the more anxiety you carry. Success can become its own prison when you spend your energy protecting what you've gained rather than engaging fully with what you're experiencing. Seneca practiced an exercise called premeditatio malorum, imagining loss before it occurred, not to become pessimistic, but to develop emotional resilience and gratitude for what currently exists. By mentally rehearsing how he would respond to losing his wealth, his reputation, or his loved ones, he freed himself from the anxiety of protecting these things and gained the capacity to enjoy them more fully. The third battlefield is ego, your sense of self that depends on external validation and comparison. The ego wants to be right, to be important, to be special. It creates stories about why you deserve particular outcomes and feels wounded when reality doesn't confirm these stories. The ego makes everything personal, interpreting neutral events as either validation or attack. Epictetus taught that you are not your reputation, your possessions, your achievements, or even your relationships. You are the consciousness that observes and chooses, the part of you that remains constant while everything else changes. This perspective doesn't diminish your importance. It locates your importance in something that can't be threatened by external circumstances. The fourth battlefield is the need for control. You want to be able to influence outcomes, to ensure that your efforts produce the results you intend. When you can't control what happens, you feel powerless and frustrated. But the Stoics discovered that this need for control is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how life works. Control is largely an illusion. You can influence many things, but you cannot control them completely. The weather doesn't consult your preferences. Other people make decisions based on their own priorities. Your body ages according to its own timeline. Markets fluctuate according to forces beyond your individual influence. Accepting this doesn't make you passive. It makes you effective because it helps you focus your energy where it can actually make a difference. The final battlefield is the resistance to present moment experience. Your mind constantly escapes to the past or future, comparing current reality to memories or projections. You live in a state of chronic dissatisfaction because you're mentally elsewhere, missing the actual life you're living while thinking about the life you've had or the life you might have. This war within is not something to win once and never fight again. It's a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choice to notice resistance as it arises and respond differently. The Stoics developed specific practices for this: evening reflection, to examine the day's internal battles; morning preparation, to set intentions for how to engage with challenges; regular reminders about what's within your control and what isn't. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to approach this internal work with patience and self-compassion. The goal isn't to eliminate all negative emotions or achieve some state of permanent equanimity. The goal is to develop awareness of your internal patterns and the ability to choose your responses rather than being completely controlled by automatic reactions. The war within isn't a problem to solve, but a practice to engage. Every moment of resistance is an opportunity to practice acceptance. Every moment of fear is an opportunity to practice courage. Every moment of ego-driven reaction is an opportunity to practice humility. Every moment of trying to control the uncontrollable is an opportunity to practice surrender. This is where the Stoics found their freedom, not in winning the war within, but in understanding how to fight it skillfully, with wisdom instead of force, with acceptance instead of resistance, with presence instead of escape. The victory isn't the absence of struggle. The victory is the transformation of struggle into practice. They were not marble statues or distant philosophers removed from the mess of human existence. They were people who lived through war, slavery, exile, loss, and the daily friction of navigating relationships, responsibilities, and their own emotional weather. What made them extraordinary was not that they avoided suffering, but that they discovered how to transform suffering into wisdom, chaos into clarity, and restlessness into unshakable peace. Marcus Aurelius governed the largest empire in human history, while plague ravaged his territories and barbarian tribes threatened his borders. He spent years away from his family, leading armies through brutal campaigns, making decisions that determined the fate of millions. His private journal, never intended for publication, reveals not a man who had transcended difficulty, but one who had learned to find stability within difficulty. "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy," he wrote, not as abstract philosophy, but as practical guidance for dealing with betrayal and political manipulation. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, "The people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own." This wasn't detached wisdom from someone insulated from human complexity. This was hard-won understanding from someone who dealt daily with the full spectrum of human behavior and had learned not to let other people's choices determine his internal state. Epictetus knew powerlessness intimately. He spent his youth as a slave, his body broken by harsh treatment, his freedom completely at the mercy of another person's whims. Yet from this experience of total external powerlessness, he discovered internal freedom that no circumstance could touch. "No one can hurt you without your permission," he taught. Not because external events don't matter, but because your response to external events matters more than the events themselves. His teachings emerged from lived experience of the worst that humans can do to each other, yet they point toward possibilities for dignity, strength, and joy that exist regardless of external conditions. He had learned that freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want. It's the ability to want whatever happens, to find meaning and purpose within whatever circumstances you encounter. Seneca navigated the treacherous world of Roman politics while building enormous wealth and trying to maintain his philosophical principles. He was exiled for 8 years, called back to serve as advisor to Emperor Nero, and ultimately forced to commit suicide when he fell out of political favor. His letters reveal someone wrestling with the practical challenges of living philosophically in an unphilosophical world. Every new thing excites the mind, but a mind made stable and steady by long practice is not moved by the sight of anything new, he wrote, drawing from years of experience with both luxury and deprivation, success and failure, favor and disgrace. He had learned that external stability is an illusion, but internal stability is achievable through practice and perspective. These were not people who had solved life, but people who had learned how to live skillfully with life's permanent unsolvability. They faced the same fundamental challenges you face: how to love without attachment, how to care without controlling, how to hope without expectation, how to engage fully while holding everything lightly. What they discovered through necessity and practice was that peace doesn't require perfect circumstances. It requires a particular way of engaging with imperfect circumstances. They learned that joy isn't something external events provide, but something internal awareness creates. They found that meaning doesn't depend on getting what you want, but on developing a different relationship with wanting itself. Their insights weren't theoretical, but practical, forged in the heat of real challenges and tested against the full range of human experience. They offer not escape from the difficulties of being human, but transformation of those difficulties into opportunities for growth, strength, and unexpected forms of fulfillment. Marcus Aurelius reminds you that your thoughts shape your experience more than your circumstances shape your experience. Epictetus shows you that freedom exists even in the most constrained situations. Seneca demonstrates that you can engage fully with worldly success while maintaining spiritual independence. Together, they point toward a way of being that doesn't require your life to be perfect in order for you to experience profound satisfaction. They show you that the peace you're seeking doesn't live at the end of some future accomplishment, but in a different way of relating to whatever you're experiencing right now. This isn't about becoming emotionless or detached. The Stoics felt deeply, loved fully, and engaged passionately with their responsibilities and relationships. But they had learned to separate their sense of well-being from the outcomes of their engagement, to find stability that didn't depend on things going according to plan. As you prepare to explore their specific teachings, remember that they developed these insights not in isolation, but in the midst of exactly the kind of complexity, uncertainty, and challenge you face in your own life. Their wisdom isn't abstract philosophy, but practical training for the ongoing project of being human. They had learned the secret that changes everything: how to be fully alive without needing life to be anything other than what it is. The lessons they offer aren't just ideas to understand, but practices to embody, ways of seeing and responding that gradually transform your experience from the inside out. What they discovered is available to you, not because you're special, but because you're human, equipped with the same fundamental capacities they learned to develop and strengthen. Their journey toward unshakable joy begins where yours does. With this moment, this breath, this choice to engage differently with whatever is happening right now. The illusion begins early. As a child, you learn that effort produces results. Study hard, get good grades, practice consistently, improve your skills, behave well, receive approval. This creates a fundamental belief that becomes so deeply embedded, you rarely question it. If you try hard enough, you can control outcomes. If something goes wrong, You either didn't try hard enough or didn't try the right way. This belief serves you in many situations. It motivates persistence, encourages responsibility, and builds confidence in your ability to influence your circumstances. But it also sets you up for a profound and ongoing frustration when reality refuses to cooperate with your efforts. You plan carefully, work diligently, and make thoughtful decisions, yet things still go sideways. Other people make choices that disrupt your intentions. Markets move in unpredictable directions. Bodies develop illnesses despite healthy habits. Relationships end despite your best efforts to maintain them. Each time this happens, you face a choice. Either question the fundamental belief in control or blame yourself for not controlling things well enough. Most people choose the second option, creating layers of anxiety, guilt, and exhaustion as they double down on trying to control the uncontrollable. The Stoics saw this clearly and offered a radical alternative, the dichotomy of control. They divided all of existence into two categories, what is up to you and what is not up to you, and suggested that peace comes from focusing exclusively on the first category while accepting the second category completely. What is up to you is remarkably small. Your choices, your responses, your attention, your effort, your values, and your character. What is not up to you is almost everything else. Outcomes, other people's decisions, natural events, your reputation, your health, the past, the future, and whether your efforts produce the results you intend. This distinction isn't theoretical. It's practical training for where to invest your mental and emotional energy. When you spend energy trying to control things that aren't up to you, you create suffering without creating change. When you focus energy on things that are up to you, you create actual influence while building inner resilience. Epictetus, who understood powerlessness better than most, taught his students to practice this distinction moment by moment. Some things are within our power, while others are not. He began his teachings not as abstract philosophy, but as immediate guidance for navigating daily frustration. Within our power are our opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, position, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. But releasing the illusion of control doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming strategic about where you direct your agency. Instead of trying to control your reputation, you focus on controlling your character. Instead of trying to control outcomes, you focus on controlling your preparation and response. Instead of trying to control other people's behavior, you focus on controlling your own behavior. This shift in focus creates what psychologists call an internal locus of control, the understanding that your experience is primarily determined by your choices rather than by external circumstances. Research consistently shows that people with an internal locus of control report higher levels of satisfaction, resilience, and psychological well-being, even when facing difficult circumstances. Consider how this applies to a relationship conflict. You cannot control whether the other person listens to you, agrees with you, or changes their behavior. You can control how clearly you communicate, how respectfully you engage, and how you respond to their choices. When you focus on what you can control, you often become more effective at influencing what you cannot control because you're working with reality instead of fighting it. The same principle applies to professional challenges. You cannot control whether you get promoted, whether your ideas are accepted, or whether your industry remains stable. You can control the quality of your work, your willingness to learn new skills, and your response to setbacks. This focus often leads to better outcomes, precisely because you're investing energy where it can actually make a difference. Marcus Aurelius faced this challenge on an imperial scale. He could not control whether his borders were attacked, whether plagues spread through his territories, or whether his political allies remained loyal. But he could control his decisions, his character, and his response to each crisis. His journal reveals someone who found freedom not by controlling his circumstances, but by controlling his relationship with his circumstances. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he reminded himself. Realize this, and you will find strength. This wasn't philosophical consolation, but practical wisdom, forged through years of learning where his actual power resided. The liberation that comes from releasing the illusion of control is profound but gradual. Your nervous system has been conditioned to feel responsible for outcomes, to feel anxious when you can't influence results, to feel guilty when things don't work out despite your efforts. Learning to distinguish between influence and control, between doing your best and guaranteeing results, takes practice and patience. Start small. Notice when you feel frustrated with traffic, weather, or other people's choices. Practice the phrase, "That's not up to me," and redirect your attention to what is up to you, your response, your breathing, your choice about how to spend this moment. Notice when you feel anxious about future outcomes and practice focusing on present choices. The goal isn't to stop caring about results, but to stop making your peace dependent on getting specific results. You can care deeply about outcomes while holding them lightly. You can work diligently toward goals while accepting that achievement isn't guaranteed. You can love people fully while accepting that you cannot control their choices. This is the first great lesson the Stoics offer. Control is largely a mirage, but your response to this truth determines whether the mirage torments you or frees you. When you stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, you discover remarkable power over what can be controlled. When you stop fighting reality, you find energy to engage with reality skillfully. The peace you're seeking doesn't require controlling your circumstances. It requires controlling your relationship with circumstances that will always remain to some degree beyond your control. This is where real freedom begins. You have been taught to avoid suffering as if it were an enemy, to medicate it, distract from it, or arrange your life to minimize its appearance. This approach seems reasonable. Why would anyone choose pain when pleasure is available? Yet the Stoics discovered something that turns this assumption upside down. Suffering, when engaged consciously, becomes one of life's most effective teachers, sculpting character in ways that comfort never could. This isn't about seeking pain or romanticizing hardship. It's about recognizing that since suffering is inevitable, your relationship with suffering determines whether it destroys you or transforms you. The question isn't whether you will face loss, disappointment, illness, failure, or grief. The question is whether you will allow these experiences to teach you something essential about resilience, compassion, and what actually matters. Marcus Aurelius understood this from direct experience. He lost multiple children, watched plague devastate his empire, and faced betrayal from people he trusted. His private reflections reveal not someone who had transcended pain, but someone who had learned to extract wisdom from pain. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it, he wrote, not as abstract philosophy, but as practical guidance forged in the fire of real loss. He learned that suffering often reveals strengths you didn't know you possessed. When comfortable routines are disrupted, you discover your capacity to adapt. When relationships end, You learn about your ability to love without guarantee. When health fails, you appreciate vitality you had taken for granted. When plans collapse, you develop skills for navigating uncertainty. But this transformation requires a conscious choice about how to relate to difficult experiences. You can approach suffering as a victim, something happening to you that shouldn't be happening, something that proves life is unfair or that you're unlucky. Or you can approach suffering as a student, something happening for you, an opportunity to develop qualities that can only be forged under pressure. Epictetus, whose early years as a slave gave him intimate knowledge of powerlessness and pain, taught that external events cannot harm your character unless you let them. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters, he insisted, drawing from lived experience of the worst that humans can do to each other. He had learned that while others could control his body and circumstances, they could not control his thoughts, values, or fundamental dignity unless he surrendered those voluntarily. This perspective transforms suffering from something that happens to you into something that happens through you. Pain becomes a refining process, burning away illusions and revealing what's actually essential. Disappointment becomes training in releasing attachment to specific outcomes. Loss becomes education in appreciating what remains. Failure becomes practice in rebuilding with greater wisdom. The Stoics called this Amor Fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance or resignation, but active embrace of whatever life presents, including the difficult parts. This doesn't mean enjoying pain, but finding meaning within pain, using obstacles as raw material for developing strength, wisdom, and compassion. Seneca, who experienced both wealth and exile, success and disgrace, wrote extensively about this principle. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he observed, recognizing that loss often creates space for unexpected forms of growth. His forced exile, which initially felt like catastrophe, became opportunity for philosophical reflection that produced some of his most profound insights. But how do you practically love your fate when your fate includes experiences you wouldn't choose? How do you embrace suffering without becoming masochistic or passive? The key lies in distinguishing between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. The physical sensation of injury, the emotional reality of loss, the mental challenge of uncertainty. Suffering is optional. The stories you tell yourself about why pain shouldn't be happening, the resistance to what is already occurring, the mental elaboration that amplifies pain into ongoing torment. When you fight reality, you create suffering on top of pain. When you accept reality while responding skillfully, you experience pain without unnecessary suffering. The difference is profound and practical. Consider how this applies to grief. The pain of losing someone you love is natural and unavoidable, but the suffering that comes from believing the loss shouldn't have happened, that life is unfair, that you should be over it by now. This suffering is created by your resistance to the natural process of grief. When you allow grief to move through you without resistance, it becomes a form of love, a way of honoring connection even after physical presence has ended. The same principle applies to failure. The disappointment of not achieving a goal is real and appropriate, but the suffering that comes from believing failure means you're inadequate, that you should have succeeded, that your worth depends on outcomes. This suffering is created by your interpretation of failure rather than by failure itself. Suffering teaches patience when you want immediate results. It teaches humility when you want to feel superior. It teaches compassion when you want to judge others. It teaches gratitude when you want to take things for granted. It teaches presence when you want to escape into distraction. But perhaps most importantly, Suffering teaches you that you can survive much more than you think you can. Each time you navigate loss, disappointment, or pain without being destroyed by it, you build evidence of your own resilience. Each time you find meaning within difficulty, you develop capacity for finding meaning anywhere. This doesn't make you callous or detached. The Stoics weren't emotionally numb. They felt deeply but weren't controlled by their feelings. They grieved losses, felt disappointed by setbacks, and experienced the full range of human emotions. But they had learned to hold these experiences as information rather than identity, as weather rather than climate. The suffering you're trying to avoid isn't your enemy. It's your teacher, offering lessons in strength, wisdom, and compassion that no comfortable experience could provide. When you stop running from these lessons, you discover that the very experiences you feared most become the foundation of an unshakable peace that doesn't depend on things going according to plan. This is love of fate, not loving everything that happens, but loving who you become through learning to respond skillfully to everything that happens. The word detachment conjures images of emotional numbness, of someone who has withdrawn from caring, who watches life unfold with the cold distance of a scientist observing specimens. This misunderstanding has made many people suspicious of Stoic teachings, imagining that developing equanimity requires sacrificing passion, love, and engagement with life. But the Stoics understood detachment as something radically different. Not the absence of feeling, but the freedom to feel without being controlled by feelings. True detachment is like being a lighthouse during a storm. The waves crash with tremendous force, the wind howls, the rain pounds relentlessly, but the lighthouse remains stable. It doesn't ignore the storm or pretend the storm isn't happening. It acknowledges the storm completely while maintaining its essential function of providing light and guidance. The lighthouse is fully present to the storm without being overwhelmed by the storm. This is the kind of detachment the Stoics cultivated. Not emotional withdrawal, but emotional resilience. They learned to experience the full spectrum of human feelings while maintaining an inner stability that didn't depend on those feelings remaining comfortable or familiar. Marcus Aurelius grieved deeply when his children died, yet he continued to govern effectively and make decisions based on wisdom rather than being paralyzed by grief. Seneca loved his friends intensely, yet he could accept their deaths without being destroyed by loss. Epictetus formed meaningful relationships with his students while understanding that attachment to specific outcomes in those relationships would only create suffering. They had learned the difference between caring and clinging, between love and attachment, between engagement and entanglement. This distinction is crucial because it determines whether your emotional life becomes a source of strength or a source of constant vulnerability. Caring means investing your attention, energy, and affection in something without making your well-being dependent on specific outcomes. You can care deeply about your work without making your self-worth dependent on professional success. You can love someone fully without making your happiness dependent on their choices. You can value your health without making your peace dependent on never getting sick. Clinging, by contrast, means making your internal state hostage to external conditions. When you cling, you cannot be at peace unless things go according to your preferences. You cannot feel secure unless you can predict and control outcomes. You cannot enjoy what you have because you're constantly worried about losing it. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron describes this as the difference between holding something with an open palm versus a closed fist. When you hold something with a closed fist, your hand cramps, your arm tires, and you cannot use that hand for anything else. When you hold something with an open palm, you can appreciate it fully while remaining free to respond to whatever else emerges. Psychological research supports this distinction. Studies show that people who can maintain emotional regulation during difficult experiences, feeling their emotions fully without being overwhelmed by them, demonstrate greater resilience, creativity, and problem-solving capacity. They're not suppressing feelings, they're creating space around feelings that allows for conscious response rather than automatic reaction. This space is what the Stoics called the pause, the moment between stimulus and response, where choice becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist, captured this perfectly. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. But developing this capacity requires practice and patience. Your nervous system has been conditioned to react immediately to emotional triggers, to become the emotion rather than the observer of the emotion. Learning to create space around your feelings feels unnatural at first, like learning to breathe underwater. Start by practicing with smaller irritations. When someone cuts you off in traffic, notice the immediate surge of anger without immediately expressing it or suppressing it. Instead, observe it. I'm noticing anger arising. This is what anger feels like in my body. This is what anger does to my thinking. This observation creates distance between you and the emotion, allowing you to choose your response rather than being controlled by automatic reaction. The same practice applies to positive emotions. When something good happens, notice the pleasure, excitement, or satisfaction without immediately grasping for more or worrying about when it will end. Let yourself feel the emotion fully while maintaining awareness that emotions are temporary experiences, not permanent states. This doesn't make you less passionate or engaged. If anything, it makes you more passionate and engaged because you're no longer using emotional energy to resist emotions or control outcomes. You're free to love fully because you're not afraid of loss. You're free to care deeply because you're not dependent on specific results. You're free to feel intensely because you're not identified with your feelings. The lighthouse doesn't love the storm, but it doesn't hate the storm either. It simply provides light regardless of weather conditions. This is the kind of stability the Stoics cultivated, not the absence of emotional weather, but the ability to function regardless of emotional weather. Seneca put it beautifully. The mind that is anxious about future misfortunes is miserable. It will be suffering before suffering even arrives. Detachment means being fully present to current experience without being tormented by anticipation of future experience or regret about past experience. This creates a paradox that only becomes clear through practice. The less you cling to outcomes, the more you can influence outcomes. The less you depend on feeling good, the more you actually feel good. The less you need things to be different, the more capacity you have to change things skillfully. Detachment is not coldness. It's the warmth of a fire that doesn't depend on external fuel to keep burning. It's the love that doesn't need to possess what it loves. It's the engagement that doesn't require guaranteed results to remain committed. This is the freedom the Stoics discovered. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom within feeling. Not freedom from caring, but freedom from being controlled by caring. Not freedom from life, but freedom to live fully regardless of what life presents. Every morning, ancient Roman generals returning from military victories would ride through the streets of Rome, in elaborate triumph parades. The crowds would cheer, music would play, and gold would glitter in the sunlight. But walking beside each general was a slave whose sole responsibility was to whisper in his ear, "Memento Mori." Remember, you will die. This wasn't cruelty or pessimism. It was wisdom. The Romans understood that remembering mortality creates clarity about what actually matters. When you truly absorb that your time is limited, that this conversation might be your last with this person, that this day might be your final opportunity to express love or make a meaningful choice, everything sharpens into focus. Most people live as if they have unlimited time, making decisions based on the assumption that there will always be another chance, another conversation, another opportunity to get things right. This illusion of infinite time creates a chronic sense of urgency about trivial things and dangerous complacency about essential things. You rush through traffic to save 3 minutes while postponing difficult conversations for years. You stress about minor inconveniences while neglecting to tell people you love them. The Stoics practiced contemplating death not to become morbid, but to become alive. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself that everyone he encountered, including himself, would eventually die. This wasn't depressing. It was liberating. It freed him from petty resentments, trivial concerns, and the exhausting effort of taking everything personally. "You could die today," he wrote in his private journal. "Let this determine your actions, words, and thoughts." This wasn't meant to create anxiety, but to create perspective. When you remember that your time with someone is finite, you listen more carefully. When you remember that your opportunities are limited, you choose more wisely. When you remember that your energy is not renewable, you invest it more thoughtfully. Death is the ultimate teacher of priorities. Nothing clarifies what matters like the recognition that everything is temporary. The promotion you're stressing about, the argument you're holding on to, the grudge you're maintaining. How important will these feel on your deathbed? This isn't meant to diminish your current concerns, but to right-size them, to help you distinguish between what deserves your attention and what deserves your energy. Seneca, who faced his own execution with remarkable composure, wrote extensively about mortality as a clarifying force. "Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life," he suggested. "Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time." This practice of daily completion, living each day as if it might be your last, doesn't create recklessness, but creates intentionality. When you're conscious of mortality, you're less likely to waste time on activities that don't align with your values. You're more likely to have the difficult conversations, express the important feelings, and take the meaningful risks that fear and procrastination normally prevent. But perhaps most importantly, remembering death transforms your relationship with life. When you truly understand that your existence is temporary, each moment becomes precious, not because it will last forever, but precisely because it won't. The coffee tastes richer because you won't drink it indefinitely. The conversation feels more meaningful because you won't have it eternally. The sunset appears more beautiful because you have limited opportunities to witness such beauty. This is the paradox of mortality. Death doesn't diminish life, it intensifies life. The knowledge that something is finite makes it more valuable, not less valuable. A song you can only hear once becomes more precious than a song you can play infinitely. A person you can only love for a limited time becomes more dear than someone you could love forever. Existential philosophers have long recognized this principle. Heidegger wrote about being toward death as the authentic way of existing, understanding that consciousness of mortality frees you from conformity and social expectations. When you know your time is limited, you're more likely to live according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. But facing mortality honestly requires courage because it means accepting uncertainty and lack of control. You cannot know when death will come, how it will happen, or whether you'll be ready. This uncertainty can create anxiety if you try to control it, or wisdom if you learn to accept it. The Stoics learned to hold death as a companion rather than an enemy. Not someone they welcomed prematurely, but someone whose presence reminded them to live fully while they had the chance. They understood that the fear of death often prevents people from truly living, creating a kind of death before death. Consider how awareness of mortality might change your daily choices. Would you spend as much time scrolling through your phone if you remembered this day will never come again? Would you hold on to anger as tightly if you remembered that your relationship with that person is temporary? Would you postpone expressing love if you remembered that opportunities for expression are finite? This doesn't mean living with constant awareness of death or becoming obsessed with mortality. It means occasionally pausing to remember the preciousness that comes from impermanence. It means using the reality of death as a lens for examining whether your current priorities align with your deepest values. The urgency that comes from remembering mortality is different from the anxiety that comes from trying to accomplish everything immediately. It's the urgency of presence, of attention, of not wasting the gift of consciousness that you've been given for this brief span of time. Marcus Aurelius captured this beautifully. Death smiles at us all, but all a man can do is smile back. This isn't resignation, but recognition. Death is part of the deal of being alive, and fighting this reality only prevents you from enjoying the time you have. When you stop running from the fact of mortality and start using it as guidance for how to live, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because life becomes clearer. The fog of trivial concerns lifts, and what remains is what has always mattered: love, meaning, connection, growth, and the precious opportunity to be conscious in a universe that has given you this temporary gift of awareness. Death gives life its urgency not to make you afraid, but to make you awake. You have been searching for joy in all the wrong places, not because you're foolish, but because you've been taught to look for it where it cannot be found. The culture around you suggests that joy is a discovery waiting to happen. The right relationship, the perfect job, the ideal living situation, the achievement that will finally deliver the happiness you've been seeking. But the Stoics understood something that transforms this entire approach. Joy is not something you find, but something you build. Not a destination you reach, but a capacity you develop. This realization changes everything, because it means joy is not dependent on external circumstances cooperating with your preferences. It means you don't have to wait for your life to be perfect to access deep satisfaction. It means that regardless of what has happened to you or what might happen to you, the fundamental capacity for contentment exists within your current experience, but only if you learn how to construct it. Building joy is like developing any other skill. It requires practice, patience, and the understanding that mastery comes through repetition rather than inspiration. You don't become physically strong by waiting to feel motivated to exercise. You become strong by exercising whether you feel motivated or not, until strength becomes part of your natural capacity. The same principle applies to emotional resilience, mental clarity, and the ability to access contentment regardless of circumstances. The Stoics developed specific practices for building this capacity, daily exercises that gradually transformed their relationship with whatever life presented. These weren't theoretical concepts, but practical tools, tested through years of application in the midst of real challenges and refined through direct experience of what actually works. The first building block is gratitude, but not the superficial gratitude that pretends everything is wonderful. This is archaeological gratitude, the practice of excavating appreciation from whatever exists, even when what exists is difficult, disappointing, or painful. Marcus Aurelius practiced this by beginning each day with reflection on what he could appreciate about his current circumstances, no matter how challenging they were. This practice trains your attention to notice what's working rather than only what's broken, what's present rather than only what's missing, what's possible rather than only what's problematic. Your brain has a natural negativity bias. It's designed to scan for threats and problems as a survival mechanism. Gratitude practice counterbalances this bias by consciously directing attention toward appreciation, creating neural pathways that make contentment more accessible. The second building block is self-command, the gradual development of internal authority over your responses, choices, and attention. This isn't about controlling outcomes, but about controlling your engagement with outcomes. Epictetus taught his students to practice small acts of discipline daily, choosing to take a cold bath, walking instead of riding, eating simple food, speaking less than usual. These exercises weren't about deprivation, but about building the capacity to choose consciously rather than reacting automatically. Self-command creates freedom from the tyranny of impulse, mood, and circumstance. When you can choose your response to hunger, discomfort, disappointment, or desire, you're no longer controlled by these experiences. This doesn't make you rigid or joyless. It makes you more able to experience joy because you're not at the mercy of external conditions for your internal state. The third building block is present moment awareness, the practice of returning attention to what's actually happening now rather than being mentally elsewhere. Your mind naturally travels to the past and future, comparing current reality to memories or projections. This mental time travel creates dissatisfaction because you're always measuring now against some other time, missing the actual experience of being alive in this moment. Seneca practiced this by regularly asking himself, what is this moment offering that I'm overlooking while thinking about other moments? This question pulls attention back to immediate experience, where life actually occurs and where contentment is always available if you're present enough to notice it. The fourth building block is philosophical reflection, the daily practice of examining your thoughts, reactions, and assumptions in light of Stoic principles. This isn't intellectual analysis, but practical wisdom application. Each evening, Seneca would review the day. Where did I react from emotion instead of wisdom? Where did I try to control things that weren't up to me? Where did I resist reality instead of working with it? This practice creates learning from experience rather than just having experiences. Without reflection, you can go through the same challenges repeatedly without developing greater capacity to handle them. With reflection, each difficulty becomes an opportunity to strengthen your philosophical muscles. The fifth building block is service to something larger than personal comfort. The Stoics understood that meaning comes from contributing to the common good. from using your capacities in service of something beyond immediate self-interest. Marcus Aurelius saw his role as emperor not as personal aggrandizement, but as service to the Roman people. This sense of purpose provided stability that didn't depend on personal circumstances remaining favorable. When you're focused on contribution rather than consumption, on giving rather than getting, on serving rather than being served, joy emerges naturally as a byproduct of meaningful engagement. This isn't martyrdom or self-sacrifice. It's the recognition that fulfillment comes from aligning your actions with your values rather than from accumulating experiences or possessions. These building blocks work together to create what the Stoics called ataraxia, unshakable tranquility that doesn't depend on external conditions remaining stable. This isn't emotional numbness, but emotional resilience. This isn't passive acceptance, but active engagement with reality as it is rather than as you wish it were. Building joy is daily work, like tending a garden or maintaining physical fitness. Some days the work feels natural and rewarding. Other days it feels difficult and mechanical. But consistency over time creates a foundation of contentment that external circumstances cannot destroy because it's not dependent on external circumstances for its existence. The joy you're seeking is not waiting for you somewhere else. It's available right now, in this moment, through the conscious cultivation of gratitude, self-command, presence, reflection, and service. Not because your current circumstances are perfect, but because joy doesn't require perfect circumstances. It requires the wisdom to build it from whatever circumstances you're given. This is the ultimate Stoic teaching. Happiness is not something that happens to you, but something you create through how you choose to engage with whatever happens to you. The power to be content is already yours. You just have to learn how to use it. The call comes at 3 a.m. The diagnosis arrives on a Tuesday. The relationship ends without warning. The job disappears in a restructuring you never saw coming. The parent you thought would live forever doesn't. These moments strip away every illusion of control you've carefully constructed, leaving you face to face with the raw reality that most of life operates according to forces beyond your influence. In these moments, all philosophical understanding gets tested against immediate emotional reality. The Stoic principles you've been learning, the dichotomy of control, acceptance of fate, focus on response rather than circumstance, either prove themselves practical wisdom or reveal themselves as pretty concepts that crumble under pressure. This is where the real work begins. Grace under pressure isn't about feeling calm when chaos erupts around you. It's about knowing where to direct your energy when everything feels urgent and important. It's about remembering what's actually within your control when your nervous system is convinced that everything is within your control, and therefore everything is your responsibility to fix. Sarah receives the diagnosis on a Thursday morning. Stage 3. The oncologist speaks in percentages and treatment protocols while her mind races through everything this changes. Work projects, travel plans, financial security, her children's stability, her husband's stress, her mother's worry. The future she had been planning evaporates, replaced by uncertainty she cannot think or effort her way out of. The old Sarah would have spiraled into research obsession, trying to control outcomes through information gathering. She would have exhausted herself, managing everyone else's emotions while neglecting her own. She would have fought the reality of illness as if resistance could change the diagnosis. But this Sarah has been practicing Stoic principles not as academic exercises, but as practical tools for exactly this kind of moment. She feels the full impact of fear, grief, and uncertainty without being overwhelmed by them. She distinguishes between what she can control, her treatment choices, her response to difficulty, her decision about how to spend her energy, and what she cannot control, the disease's progression, other people's reactions, the ultimate outcome. This doesn't make her emotionless or detached. She grieves the loss of the future she had imagined. She feels afraid of pain, of leaving her children, of the unknown. But she doesn't waste emotional energy fighting the reality of having cancer. Instead, she invests that energy in responding to cancer skillfully, researching treatment options, having honest conversations with her family, making decisions about how to live fully within whatever time she has. Marcus feels the marriage ending like a physical blow. 23 years dissolving in a conversation that lasts 47 minutes. The plans they made, the retirement they had saved for, the rhythm of life they had built together, all of it suddenly irrelevant. His first impulse is to negotiate, to explain, to fight for something that has already ended in his partner's heart. But Marcus has learned to pause between impulse and action, to create space for conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. He feels the anger, the hurt, the desperation to make this different than it is. Then he asks himself the question that has become his anchor. What is actually within my control right now? He cannot control his partner's feelings, decisions, or timeline. He cannot control the legal process, the financial implications, or how their friends will respond. He can control his own behavior, his commitment to dignity during difficulty, his choice about whether to respond from wisdom or from wound. This doesn't eliminate the pain, but it transforms the pain from something that happens to him into something he moves through consciously. He grieves the end of the marriage without making his partner's choices mean something about his worth. He feels disappointed without becoming a victim of disappointment. He faces uncertainty about the future without losing sight of what remains stable: his values, his capacity to love, his ability to build meaning from whatever circumstances emerge. Eleanor watches her startup collapse despite 2 years of 18-hour days, despite sacrificing relationships and health, despite doing everything the advisors recommended. The funding falls through. The team disperses. The vision she had poured her life into becomes a folder of documents on a computer drive. The old Eleanor would have taken this as personal failure, evidence that she wasn't smart enough, hadn't worked hard enough, didn't deserve success. She would have replayed every decision, looking for the moment where different choices might have produced different results. She would have carried the weight of other people's disappointment along with her own. But this Elena has learned that outcomes are not reliable measures of effort, character, or worth. She feels the grief of seeing her dream end, while recognizing that the dream ending doesn't negate the growth that came from pursuing it. She failed to build the company she envisioned, but she succeeded in building skills, relationships, and self-knowledge that will serve her regardless of what comes next. She allows herself to feel disappointed without being defined by disappointment. She processes the loss without making the loss mean she should stop taking meaningful risks. She faces the uncertainty of starting over without losing confidence in her capacity to navigate uncertainty. This is grace under pressure, not the absence of difficulty, but a different relationship with difficulty. Not the elimination of emotional reaction, but conscious response rather than unconscious reaction. Not control over circumstances, but mastery over your engagement with circumstances. Grace emerges when you stop fighting reality and start working with reality. When you stop demanding that life be fair and start responding to life as it actually is. When you stop making your peace dependent on things going according to plan and start finding peace within whatever plan emerges. The uncontrollable events will keep coming because that's the nature of being alive in a world where you're not the only agent making decisions. Other people will choose differently than you hope. Natural forces will operate according to their own logic. Time will change everything you've built. Bodies will age and fail. Relationships will evolve and sometimes end. But in the space between what happens to you and how you respond to what happens to you lies your freedom. In that space, you can choose courage over fear, wisdom over reactivity, grace over bitterness, growth over stagnation. The Stoics discovered that this freedom is not diminished by difficult circumstances, it's revealed by them. Easy times don't require philosophical depth. Comfortable situations don't demand emotional maturity. Predictable outcomes don't call forth your highest capacities, but crisis does, loss does, uncertainty does. The uncontrollable events that disrupt your plans also create opportunities to discover strengths you didn't know you possessed, to develop wisdom that only comes through testing, to access grace that emerges only when you need it most. This is the deepest Stoic insight. You are not broken by what happens to you. You are revealed by how you respond to what happens to you. And in that revelation lies a freedom that no external circumstance can touch. Your inner life has architecture just like your physical space. Some people live in mental environments that feel chaotic, cramped and reactive. Thoughts scattered like clutter, emotions overwhelming like poor lighting, responses automatic, like doors that slam shut at the slightest pressure. Others have learned to construct internal spaces that feel spacious, stable, and intentional. Thoughts organized like a well-designed library, emotions flowing like natural light, responses chosen like carefully placed furniture. This architecture doesn't develop accidentally. It requires the same conscious design, patient construction, and ongoing maintenance that any lasting structure demands. The Stoics understood that joy, peace, and resilience aren't personality traits you either have or lack. They're capacities you build through daily practice, brick by brick, choice by choice, moment by moment. Consider how you currently begin your day. Do you reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor, immediately filling your consciousness with other people's thoughts, problems, and agendas? Do you check email before you've checked in with yourself, starting the day reactive rather than intentional? Or have you created a morning ritual that grounds you in your own values and priorities before engaging with external demands? Marcus Aurelius began each day with written reflection, using his private journal not just to record events, but to remind himself of Stoic principles, to prepare mentally for the challenges ahead, to align his intentions with his deepest values. These weren't abstract philosophical musings, but practical preparation for governing an empire while maintaining inner equilibrium. When you wake up in the morning, he wrote to himself, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. Then make that day count. This wasn't positive thinking, but intentional thinking, deliberately directing attention toward appreciation and purpose rather than allowing his mind to default to worry and reactivity. Seneca practiced evening reflection with equal discipline, examining each day like a craftsman, evaluating his work. Where did I respond wisely? Where did I react from emotion rather than wisdom? What can I learn from today's challenges to handle tomorrow's more skillfully? This practice transformed daily experience from something that happened to him into raw material for developing character and wisdom. But inner architecture goes beyond morning and evening practices. It includes the small, seemingly insignificant choices that accumulate over time to create your internal environment. How you respond when someone cuts you off in traffic. Whether you complete tasks you've committed to completing. How you speak to yourself when you make mistakes. Whether you choose the easy path or the growth path when facing minor discomforts. Epictetus taught his students to practice discipline in small things as training for maintaining wisdom in large things. Choose to take cold baths when warm ones are available. Walk when you could ride. Eat simple food when elaborate options exist. Speak less than you want to speak. These exercises weren't about deprivation, but about developing the capacity to choose consciously rather than automatically following impulse and preference. Each small act of conscious choice strengthens what the Stoics called prohairesis, your faculty of moral choice, your capacity to align actions with values rather than being controlled by circumstances, emotions, or social pressure. Like physical exercise, this capacity grows stronger through regular use and atrophies through neglect. The architecture of inner joy also requires creating space for silence and reflection. In a culture addicted to noise, stimulation, and constant connectivity, deliberately choosing periods of quiet becomes a radical act of self-care. Not silence as escape from life, but silence as deeper engagement with life, as opportunity to hear your own thoughts, notice your own patterns, and reconnect with what actually matters beneath the surface urgency of daily demands. This might mean turning off your phone for the first hour after waking, taking walks without podcasts or music, eating meals without television or reading, sitting quietly for 10 minutes each day without agenda or entertainment. These practices create internal spaciousness that makes wisdom and peace more accessible when you need them most. Inner architecture also includes what you choose to feed your mind. Just as your physical body is built from the food you consume, your mental and emotional body is built from the information, relationships, and experiences you regularly absorb. Reading philosophical texts, spending time with people who challenge you to grow, engaging with art that elevates your consciousness, these choices shape your internal environment as surely as choosing healthy food shapes your physical health. The Stoics were particular about their intellectual diet. They read widely but critically, seeking wisdom rather than mere information, depth rather than superficial stimulation. They chose friendships with people who shared their commitment to virtue and growth, rather than simply seeking entertainment or validation. But perhaps most importantly, inner architecture requires patience with the construction process. You cannot build a cathedral in a weekend, and you cannot transform deeply ingrained mental and emotional patterns through occasional effort. The changes happen gradually, sometimes imperceptibly, through consistent daily practice over months and years. There will be days when the practices feel mechanical, when you don't feel like reflecting or choosing consciously or maintaining disciplines. These are often the most important days for continuing anyway, not because the practices themselves are magical, but because consistency builds the internal infrastructure that supports you when motivation fails and circumstances become difficult. Think of a temple built to last centuries. The builders don't skip steps because they're not in the mood to lay foundation stones properly. They understand that every brick matters, that shortcuts in construction create structural weaknesses that will reveal themselves under pressure. Your inner architecture deserves the same care and attention. The goal isn't perfection, but progress. Not the elimination of all negative thoughts and emotions, but the development of a different relationship with thoughts and emotions. Not constant happiness, but consistent access to the kind of deep contentment that doesn't depend on external circumstances remaining favorable. As you build this inner architecture, you'll notice changes that feel almost magical but are actually quite logical. Situations that used to overwhelm you become manageable. People who used to trigger automatic reactions lose their power to control your emotional state. Setbacks that used to feel devastating become opportunities for applying wisdom. Joy that used to feel dependent on everything going right becomes accessible even when things go wrong. This is the power of inner architecture. It creates a stable foundation for experiencing whatever life presents. The storms still come, but you're no longer at their mercy. The challenges still arise, but you meet them from a place of strength rather than reactivity. The difficulties still matter, but they no longer determine whether you can access peace. You become like the temple the Stoics envisioned, beautiful, functional, and built to last. Cherry blossoms bloom for only a few weeks each spring, and it's precisely their brevity that makes them so achingly beautiful. People travel thousands of miles to witness these moments of perfect fragility, knowing that waiting another week might mean missing them entirely. The flowers are beautiful, not despite their impermanence, but because of it. Their temporary existence makes each petal more precious, each viewing more meaningful, each moment of bloom a gift to be received rather than possessed. Everything in your life follows the same principle, though you spend most of your energy trying to pretend it doesn't. Your relationships are temporary, not because they're destined to fail, but because everyone involved is changing, aging, and will eventually die. Your health is temporary, not because illness is inevitable, but because bodies are dynamic systems that cannot remain static forever. Your current circumstances are temporary, not because nothing good can last, but because life is a process of constant becoming rather than a state of permanent being. Most people experience impermanence as a problem to solve, a source of anxiety to manage, a reality to resist through planning, insurance, and the illusion of control. They love something and immediately begin worrying about losing it. They enjoy a moment and immediately start trying to make it permanent. They find happiness and immediately start building walls around it to protect it from change. But the Stoics discovered something revolutionary. Impermanence is not the enemy of joy, but its deepest source. When you truly accept that everything you love is temporary, you stop taking it for granted. When you truly understand that every moment is unrepeatable, you pay attention differently. When you truly embrace that nothing lasts forever, you become present to what exists right now. This isn't about becoming resigned or passive. It's about discovering the fierce tenderness that emerges when you love something without needing to possess it permanently, when you care deeply without demanding guarantees, when you invest fully without requiring control over outcomes. Maria learned this lesson while caring for her mother through the final stages of Alzheimer's. Each day brought visible losses, memories disappearing, personality shifting, the woman who had raised her gradually becoming someone else entirely. Maria's initial response was to fight these changes, to spend enormous energy trying to keep her mother mentally present, to rage against the disease that was stealing the person she loved. But somewhere in the middle of this process, Maria's perspective shifted. Instead of focusing on what was being lost, she began noticing what remained. Instead of grieving the conversations they could no longer have, she learned to appreciate the wordless moments of connection they could still share. Instead of demanding that her mother remain the same, she discovered love that could adapt to whoever her mother was becoming. This shift didn't eliminate the sadness, but it transformed the sadness from bitter resistance into tender acceptance. Maria learned to hold each moment with her mother as complete in itself, rather than as a step towards some imagined perfect outcome. She stopped trying to make their relationship permanent and started allowing it to be exactly what it was in each present moment. The beauty of impermanence reveals itself when you stop fighting it and start working with it. Like a skilled sailor who doesn't resist the wind but uses it to move in the desired direction, you can learn to use the temporary nature of existence as guidance for how to live rather than as evidence that life is tragic. When you know that your time with someone is limited, you listen more carefully to their stories. When you understand that your current phase of life won't last forever, you engage more fully with its unique opportunities and challenges. When you accept that your body will age and change, you appreciate its current capacities instead of taking them for granted. This perspective transforms ordinary moments into occasions for gratitude. The morning coffee becomes more flavorful when you remember that you won't drink it forever. The conversation with your child becomes more precious when you accept that they're growing up and changing every day. The walk in your neighborhood becomes more meaningful when you understand that seasons change, bodies age, and opportunities for simple pleasures are finite. Death, in this context, becomes not the opposite of life, but life's most profound teacher. The knowledge that everything ends gives everything weight. The fact that nothing lasts forever makes everything matter right now. Mortality isn't the enemy of meaning, it's the source of meaning, creating urgency without anxiety, preciousness without possessiveness. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. Despite having more power than perhaps any human in history, he regularly contemplated the temporary nature of his empire, his relationships, and his own existence. Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight, he wrote. Not as consolation for loss, but as recognition that change is the very mechanism through which life creates beauty, growth, and meaning. But accepting impermanence doesn't mean becoming passive about change or indifferent to outcomes. It means engaging fully with whatever phase of life you're in, while holding it lightly enough that you can adapt when it inevitably transforms into something else. It means caring deeply without clinging desperately. It means loving completely without demanding permanence. This creates a paradox that only becomes clear through experience. The more fully you accept that something is temporary, the more completely you can enjoy it. The more deeply you understand that someone will eventually leave your life, the more presence you bring to your time together. The more clearly you see that your current circumstances will change, the more gratitude you feel for what they offer right now. Seneca practiced this by regularly imagining the loss of things he valued, not to become pessimistic, but to cultivate appreciation. By mentally rehearsing how he would respond to losing his wealth, his reputation, or his loved ones, he freed himself from the anxiety of protecting these things and gained the capacity to enjoy them more fully while they remained. The beauty of impermanence is that it makes everything a gift rather than an entitlement. You didn't earn the sunset. It was given to you for this moment. You didn't deserve the love you receive. It was offered to you for however long it lasts. You didn't purchase your health. It was granted to you for this period of your life. When you see life as a series of gifts rather than possessions, impermanence becomes not a threat, but a reminder to receive each gift fully. The cherry blossoms teach you not to mourn their falling, but to celebrate their blooming. The temporary nature of everything beautiful teaches you not to grasp, but to appreciate, not to possess, but to witness, not to control, but to participate. This is the deepest form of love, loving something so completely that you're willing to let it be exactly what it is, for exactly as long as it lasts, without demanding that it be anything else or last any longer than it does. In this love lies a freedom that no circumstance can threaten, because it doesn't depend on circumstances remaining the same. It's the freedom to be fully present to whatever is happening right now, knowing that right now is all any of us ever actually have. The most radical act of love is to want someone to become fully themselves, even when that self differs from who you need them to be. This sounds simple until you examine how much of what you call love is actually a sophisticated form of negotiation. You'll provide affection, attention, and approval in exchange for behavior that makes you feel secure, validated, or comfortable. You love them for who they are, you tell yourself, while subtly trying to shape them into who you want them to be. True love requires letting go of the fantasy that you can love someone into remaining the same forever. People grow, change, discover new aspects of themselves, and sometimes evolve in directions you didn't anticipate or wouldn't choose. Your partner develops interests that don't include you. Your children make decisions you wouldn't make. Your friends move through phases that feel foreign to your experience. Your parents age into versions of themselves you don't recognize. The choice in these moments is always the same. Will you love who they're becoming, or will you try to love them back into who they used to be? David watches his daughter prepare for college with a mixture of pride and panic. For 18 years he's been central to her daily life, helping with homework, driving to activities, sharing meals and conversations that have shaped both of their worlds. Now she talks excitedly about living across the country, about experiences that won't include him, about becoming someone he might not immediately recognize. His first impulse is to find reasons why staying closer to home would be better for her. The program isn't really superior. The distance will be hard on the family. She'll miss important events. But underneath these rational arguments, David recognizes something more honest. He's trying to keep her small enough to remain his in the way she's always been his. This is the moment that defines mature love. The choice between holding on and letting go, between loving for your own comfort and loving for their growth, between keeping them safe in your world and supporting them as they create their own world. David has been studying Stoic philosophy not as academic exercise, but as practical preparation for exactly this kind of letting go. He recognizes that his daughter's independence isn't something happening to him, but something happening for her. His job as her father isn't to keep her dependent, but to raise her capable of independence. His love isn't proven by how much she needs him, but by how well she can thrive without him. This doesn't eliminate the grief of letting go, but it transforms the grief from resistance into celebration. He mourns the end of one phase of their relationship while supporting the beginning of another phase. He feels sad about daily presence ending while feeling proud that daily presence is no longer necessary. He experiences loss while recognizing that the loss proves the success of his parenting rather than its failure. Sarah faces a different but related challenge as her husband of 15 years begins expressing interests and perspectives that feel foreign to her. He's taking classes in philosophy, meditation, and creative writing, subjects that never interested him before. He talks about concepts she doesn't understand and pursues friendships with people she doesn't particularly enjoy. The man she married is becoming someone she's not sure she married. Her initial response is to feel betrayed, as if he's broken some unspoken contract to remain the person she fell in love with. She finds herself criticizing his new interests, dismissing his philosophical explorations, and feeling threatened by the time he spends on activities that don't include her. But then she asks herself a Stoic question. Is my discomfort with his growth about him or about me? Is my resistance to his changing about love or about control? Am I upset that he's becoming someone different, or that I'm no longer the center of his becoming? This inquiry reveals an uncomfortable truth. Much of what she experienced as love was actually attachment to a particular version of him that made her feel secure and important. She loved him partly because of who he was, but also partly because of how his being who he was made her feel about herself. Real love, she discovers, means supporting his growth even when that growth leads him in directions she wouldn't choose, even when it challenges her to grow in ways she wouldn't choose. It means being curious about who he's becoming rather than nostalgic for who he used to be. It means finding security in her own development rather than in his remaining static. This shift doesn't guarantee that they'll grow in compatible directions. Sometimes people evolve in ways that make their relationship less viable, and mature love includes accepting that possibility. But it does guarantee that whatever happens will be based on authentic choice rather than manipulation, on freedom rather than control, on love rather than fear. The Stoics understood that clinging creates the very loss it tries to prevent. When you hold someone too tightly, you squeeze out the space they need to remain themselves. When you love conditionally, based on them remaining the same, you create pressure for them to hide their growth, deny their evolution, or rebel against your constraints. Epictetus, who experienced the ultimate form of being controlled by another person, taught that love means wanting what's best for someone even when what's best for them isn't what's best for you. It means celebrating their freedom even when their freedom creates uncertainty for you. It means supporting their choices even when their choices disappoint your preferences. This creates a paradox that reveals itself through practice. The more space you give someone to leave, the more likely they are to stay. The more freedom you offer someone to change, the more likely they are to include you in their changing. The more you love them for who they're becoming rather than who they've been, the more they can become themselves while remaining connected to you. But this requires developing your own internal stability that doesn't depend on other people remaining predictable. It requires building your sense of security from your own growth, rather than from controlling other people's growth. It requires finding meaning in your own becoming, rather than in preventing other people's becoming. Marcus Aurelius, despite holding ultimate political power, practiced powerlessness in his personal relationships. He loved his wife, children, and friends, while accepting that he could not control their health, choices, or longevity. He grieved deeply when they died, while not allowing grief to become bitterness about the temporary nature of all human connection. This is love without clinging, caring deeply while holding lightly, investing fully while accepting uncertainty, supporting growth while releasing control over the direction of that growth. It's the love that sets people free to be themselves, knowing that only people who are free to leave can genuinely choose to stay. In this freedom lies the deepest intimacy possible, connection based on choice rather than obligation, on appreciation rather than possession, on mutual growth rather than mutual stagnation. It's the kind of love that doesn't end when circumstances change, because it was never dependent on circumstances remaining the same. This is the love the Stoics discovered, love that doesn't cling because it doesn't need to, love that doesn't control because it trusts, love that doesn't possess because it understands that the best things in life can only be received, never owned. And in this love lies a joy that no loss can threaten, because it was never dependent on permanence for its existence. After the storm passes, something remains, not the absence of weather, but a deeper stability that was always present beneath the turbulence, waiting to be discovered. The trees that seem to bend beyond breaking find themselves still rooted. The foundation that felt so shaken reveals itself as solid. The peace you thought was lost was simply obscured by the noise of fighting what could not be fought. This is where the Stoic journey leads, not to a life without difficulties, but to a way of being that doesn't depend on difficulties disappearing. Not to circumstances that finally cooperate with your preferences, but to a relationship with circumstances that finds meaning and even joy in the midst of whatever emerges. You have learned that control is largely illusion, but this knowledge has freed you to focus on what you can actually influence. You have discovered that suffering can be a teacher when you stop running from its lessons. You have seen that detachment isn't coldness, but the warmth of a love that doesn't need to possess what it loves. You have faced the reality of mortality and found that remembering death makes life more precious, not less meaningful. Most importantly, you have begun to build joy rather than search for it, constructing a foundation of contentment that doesn't require external validation for its stability. This transformation doesn't happen dramatically, like a conversion experience or sudden enlightenment. It emerges gradually, almost imperceptibly, through thousands of small choices to respond rather than react, to accept rather than resist, to focus on what's within your control rather than becoming consumed by what isn't. One day you notice that the traffic jam doesn't trigger the same frustration it used to. Not because traffic has improved, but because you've stopped making your peace dependent on traffic moving according to your schedule. You use the time to listen to music, practice breathing, or simply observe the world around you. The external circumstances remain the same, but your relationship with those circumstances has fundamentally changed. Another day, you realize that criticism from others doesn't devastate you the way it once did. Not because criticism has stopped hurting, but because you've learned to distinguish between feedback that serves your growth and feedback that serves someone else's emotional needs. You can listen to what's useful while letting go of what isn't, neither defending yourself against every negative comment nor accepting every negative comment as truth. You find yourself less anxious about future outcomes, not because you've become indifferent to results, but because you've developed confidence in your ability to respond skillfully to whatever results emerge. You still have preferences, make plans, and work toward goals, but your well-being no longer depends on those goals being achieved exactly as you envision them. The relationships in your life begin to feel different, more spacious, less desperate, more appreciative. You love people without needing them to be anything other than what they are. You enjoy their company without requiring them to provide something you lack. You support their growth without trying to direct the direction of that growth. This creates intimacy based on freedom rather than need, on choice rather than obligation. Work becomes less about proving yourself and more about contributing something meaningful. Success feels good when it comes, but failure doesn't destroy your sense of worth. You engage fully with professional challenges while holding your identity lightly enough that career setbacks don't become existential crises. Even loss, which still hurts, still matters, still disrupts your life, becomes something you can move through without being permanently broken by. You grieve fully without becoming trapped in grief. You feel disappointed without becoming defined by disappointment. You experience anger without being controlled by anger. This is not emotional numbness, but emotional resilience. Not the absence of strong feelings, but the capacity to feel strongly without being overwhelmed. Not detachment from life, but deeper engagement with life based on wisdom rather than reactivity. The quiet joy that emerges from this way of living is different from the happiness you used to seek. It's not dependent on things going well, though it's enhanced when they do. It's not fragile in the face of difficulty, though it's not immune to pain. It's not exciting in the way that getting what you want is exciting, but it's more reliable than any external source of satisfaction. This joy feels like coming home to yourself after a long journey of looking for yourself in other places. It feels like discovering that what you thought you needed to find was already present, waiting to be uncovered beneath layers of anxiety, striving, and resistance to what is. Marcus Aurelius described this as living according to your true nature, not the nature that wants immediate gratification, external validation, or control over outcomes, but the deeper nature that finds meaning in virtue, growth, and service to something larger than personal comfort. When you align your daily choices with this deeper nature, satisfaction emerges naturally as a byproduct of integrity rather than as a goal to pursue. Seneca wrote about this as the difference between pleasure and joy. Pleasure depends on external conditions, good food, beautiful weather, favorable circumstances. Joy emerges from internal conditions, wisdom, virtue, acceptance of reality as it is. Pleasure is temporary because external conditions are temporary. Joy can be permanent because it's based on capacities you can develop and maintain regardless of what happens around you. Epictetus taught that this joy is available to anyone willing to do the work of developing it, regardless of their circumstances. Slaves can access it as easily as emperors, poor people as readily as wealthy people, sick people as completely as healthy people. It doesn't depend on being lucky in life, but on being skillful with whatever life provides. But perhaps most remarkably, this joy doesn't isolate you from others, but connects you more deeply with them. When you're no longer desperately seeking happiness from external sources, you become capable of genuinely appreciating what others offer. When you're not using relationships to fill internal voids, you can love people for who they are rather than for what they provide. When you're not defending against loss, you can be fully present to connection. The storm passes, and what remains is not the absence of weather, but your capacity to find shelter within yourself, regardless of weather. The difficulties continue, and what remains is not the absence of challenge, but your ability to meet challenge with grace. The impermanence continues, and what remains is not the absence of loss, but your capacity to love fully despite the certainty of loss. This is the stillness the Stoics discovered. Not empty silence, but the profound quiet of being at home in your own life, whatever that life contains. Not the peace of having everything you want, but the peace of wanting whatever you have. Not the joy of perfect circumstances, but the joy of being perfectly present to imperfect circumstances. In this stillness lies everything you were seeking when you began this journey, not because you found it somewhere else, but because you discovered it was never anywhere else to find. The quiet joy of being was always here, waiting beneath the noise of wanting things to be different than they are. Now you know how to listen for it. Now you know how to rest in it. Now you know that no external storm can destroy what was never dependent on external calm for its existence. This is where peace lives. This is where joy resides. This is where you have always belonged.